My name is Michael Gormley, and I'm the Executive Director of Artist Equity Association. And I'm very happy today to do our first digital salon. This is a new format for us, so please bear with us as we kind of work out the kinks and work that out with you. But again, we're very excited to be able to offer this online. As you know, if you're members of Artist Equity, we usually do monthly salons in the gallery with the work around us, and we're all sheltering in, so we aren't getting a chance to do that. But we really wanted you to see Melanie Vote's work, and the name of the show was The Washhouse, and nothing ever happens here. And we decided that we would do, you got to see a 360 view of the gallery, and we want to thank Julian Gardar for putting that together. That's Melanie's husband. And there's gonna be a lovely little video after I speak, so you can get sort of an idea more about and seeing the gallery and the installation. And also there'll be a reading by the poet Kelly, who owns the property. So David Cohen is going to moderate the panel discussion today. And David, as you know, is the editor of Art Critical. So I'm going to let us all get rolling, because we all know that our Zoom attention span is rather limited, because we've all been Zooming to stay alive for the last 3 weeks. But again, welcome. I'm glad to see you all. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and look for us online. We're moving all exhibitions there. We've got great opportunities happening. We're doing a membership sale next week, all to stay in touch with you guys and give you the art and the offerings and the programming that you've come to love from Equity Gallery. Okay, enough from me. Have fun.
Regarding the question of ownership. The rain on the tin roof of the Washhouse runs off the backside, hitting a slab from the maple that was taken down by a professional crew earlier this year. The Washhouse had a thick cement floor, until two little girls smashed it into pieces with a sledgehammer and stacked the irregular chunks just outside the door. The painter comes year after year and assembles her easel to reproduce the details of this structure. She can't paint fast enough because each season further weathers the boards. Last year, entering the Washhouse, there was a pile of fine dirt as tall as our knees. It took a live trap to know for sure that this was the work of a groundhog. We relocated it 6 miles away. If you look at the outside of the shed, you don't know what is going on inside. If you look at the inside of the shed, you don't know what is going on below it. If you look below it, you still don't know the history of this land, the way this soil didn't even start out here, but was carried in the skirt of the wind. There is a kind of enlightenment to be found in staring at one thing. And somehow by doing so, maybe you can come to know about the baby buried in the yard, or about the woman who camped alone by the fire ring and heard voices all night. Maybe you can even come to know about the osprey who hunts the pond, using positioning to obscure its own shadow warning from the fish. The present just keeps heaping itself onto the past. So many layers of wallpaper, so many decades of flooring, carpet over linoleum over wood. When we add our own part, we write messages inside of the walls. During the renovation, countless people asked why we didn't just bulldoze the place, much like others asked years earlier why anybody would sell good farmland to the state. The barn here is not suited to modern equipment, but we haven't torn it down. Not even for the good money people say they will pay for the ancient boards. I pay the taxes every year on this property, but I am still mystified how a person can own property. There are philosophers who believe we only rightfully own what we produce, that owning land is a form of theft. And Emerson declared, "The landscape belongs to the person who looks at it." I don't understand how it could be that I can sell a walnut tree to a tree buyer. How can a person own a tree? Something time-rooted in this drifted soil. Consider how this tree began here long before I was born in the delivery room of a military hospital in a faraway state. How this tree was already finding purchase in the lush soil. The name on the title has changed 3 times since then. Because it is my name on the paper at this point in history, I could sell all of the trees. I could girdle or fell or burn the trees. I could bulldoze these hills and this house and this barn. I could sell the dirt by the truckload. For $1,000 a year in property taxes, I can trap the groundhogs, make a junkyard out of the barnyard by stacking old cars and ruined tires and travel trailers that have seen better days. I could farm it, or I could charge someone money so that they can farm it, because somehow in the twist of history, this became temporarily mine. But I can't stop thinking about what the painter's dad said. Everyone has to have some place to be. So if you throw an imaginary grid over all of the land that exists and print plat maps that show who owns which piece, and you bind those maps into books that are reprinted year after year, what happens to the people whose names are not in that book?
Kelly, thank you so much for the submission and years of collaboration. And so I would like to share with you just some still images right now from the exhibition and give you a little bit of insight about the Washhouse and how this all came into being. So I'm starting out with a screen here that you've seen in the video already, but this is where it all began. This little shed, this humble structure, drew me in with magnetic pole, and it kept luring me back. It made me ask questions about the place, who lived here before, why the structure is still intact when many things are riddled by weather and tornadoes and everything in this area. So the next year I went back and finished it to this point. Obviously it's not a really, it's more of a sketch than anything, but at a certain point I realized I got enough out of it and had some ideas of what I wanted to do. So I headed back to the studio and built this little model, and the model comes apart. And I started to think about how I wanted to see this come into being as an exhibition, as individual works of art. And I thought about just pulling it apart, deconstructing it, and thinking of this as like the skeleton of the building. And that's what leads us to the exhibition at Equity. So from this little model, I decided to kind of retrofit this structure, or part of the structure, into the gallery. And what we see here on the walls are a series of landscapes and still lifes that are a reflection of the life, or the lives that could have been part of this place. So as we go through, I have a series of stains and evidence. Two pieces are called evidence, and the other two stains. And I'm thinking with these about the impact that we leave upon the planet. So in this one, I'm thinking, I guess, through the cards, that there's an understanding of a sense of toil and struggle here with this. And I don't read tarot cards, but I just actually thought these two images were compelling together. And this piece, it's kind of a strange thing. It's a lot of things, like all of them, layers of meaning piled into one painting. These are coveralls, and or overalls, and the piece is called Stain Overalls. And again, talking about our human impact upon the landscape. It's both riddled with a sense of nostalgia on top of knowing that things have to change. It's as if the human that wore them evaporated, and maybe all humans evaporated except for the one person left remaining to see the piece. I wanted it to feel kind of iconic and frozen in time. And this is a small piece. All of them are rather small, these still lifes and landscape pieces. This leads us to the barn. So last summer, this became my studio for about 3 weeks total. The barn, I've enjoyed for years, but what really lured me in is the way that it was draped. And if you want to know why, you can ask Kelly Madigan about why there were these quilts hanging off the rafters. But it was beautiful, and I just decided to both paint it from the outside, and I ended up taking up residence inside. Later, after coming back to the studio, I don't know if you can see from the screen here, but there's a little presence of a shoe at the bottom, or a person, perhaps. Again, maybe that person is the only person remaining to see this floating dress in the sky. And these are thoughts that come through my mind as I'm painting. So this particular dress is a tiny little garment that I don't know I don't know if it was I have it, but I don't know if it was a baptismal dress or what. It was wrapped around a doll that I found in my parents' garage. And it was twice the size of the doll, but I kept the dress and painted it here, floating in the sky. And this piece, the landscape in both of these are kind of connected. It was a day and night piece, looking out, or morning and afternoon painting session. So the landscapes actually kind of continue here. And the rolling hills that you see in the back are the Lust Hills that the Washhouse is tucked into. When we look at this, the strange floating jar in the sky, it could have multiple meanings to me. When I look at something like this, and seeing it bear the date of 1858, and think about all the change this landscape was undergoing at that time, and how it's evolved since that time, we have such a layered history to think about. The Western expansion, displacement of Native people, and the lands keep rolling the history, or all the history, back into itself, and the grass keeps growing, and the years keep rolling by. That leads me to this painting here that's actually pictured in the Washhouse. So I've given this painting the name Susan B, but it's not really Susan B. I'll explain who it is later. So here's the skeletal view of the Washhouse with a pile of grit and cement found partially on the Lower East Side. So entering back into the Washhouse and contemplating who Susan B was, actually this image is a depiction of a photograph that I found in an antique store nearby Castana, Iowa. And the layers of stories just keep piling on top of themselves. So I imagine this to be Susan B. And you're probably asking, who is Susan B? Well, she is someone that I learned about while there, and someone that basically moved to the region in around the 1840s, and in a miserable state took her own life. And anyway, the story gets complicated. There's a monument to her in the middle of a cornfield, in the middle of nowhere. But of course, I kind of just mingle these stories together, and there's a lot of that goes on here. Back to the barn. The barn is where a lot of these ideas kind of culminated, and this is the interior, looking out the small portal beyond the quilts. Okay, So there's so many stories here. The next year I came back and did this door and then the next door, and leading us back to the pieces of the Washhouse. Here's another unknown person that was collected from the photographs from the antique or flea markets nearby. And these are actually another source. I collected these in Brooklyn. And these are Rosemary's shoes. If you want to know more about this, just ask me. And then here are some details of the Washhouse. So as you can see, or you know already from the video, I decided that I wanted to create the facade of the Washhouse at 3/4 life size in pieces. And these are just some of my favorite pieces. They're cutouts made in birch ply, from birch ply panels. And here is the open door, one of the cement pieces at the bottom. The Washhouse window, which you can see a distorted view of the Luss Hills in the reflection. And here is a small piece where you can see the edge. Each one of the edges were painted so they felt like objects. And here's the piece as all of the pieces as a unified whole. If space allowed, you could imagine seeing it this way. All right, that leads us to me saying thank you to all of these people listed here that are here today. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Equity Gallery, to David, to all my students, and especially Maria Lupiana, who's helped me a lot in the last couple of years, for the New York Academy and all their support and their community at large. The Clemente, Julian for all his help, Doug and Isabel Chafa for all their insights into the natural world, and for Kelly for allowing me to be a continual interloper into her world. Okay, and now that leads us to the panel discussion. So first, David Cohen's going to moderate the panel. And now, David, I'm going to hand the steering wheel over to you, metaphorically.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I was very lucky to actually make it to the opening of your exhibition, which is just as well, because that was pretty much it. That's a familiar story, alas, for many artists who've been working for ages on their shows. And
Yes.
I've actually been following the progress of Melanie's exhibition for quite a while, and have taken groups of students to her studio as a busman's holiday kind of way of doing some research for a catalogue note that I'm just finishing up. And it should be mentioned, by the way, that there's going to be a rather splendid publication that accompanies this exhibition. And unlike the exhibition, perhaps, the publication is something you can very much hold in your hands, and it's going to be a visceral and tangible thing to enjoy for years to come. Essays, of course, by Kelly Madigan and myself, and works that we've now seen in Melanie's presentation. Now, I know that this is something that was touched on, Kelly, in your poems, and but I want to, just for the sake of the audience, and it's better to repeat than to not grasp it. This is a kind of strange personal private residency program. Artists go off to places like the MacDowell Fellowship or Yardo, and spend a lot of time doing some wonderful work and quite a lot of time socializing and misbehaving. But that's all part of the artist's life. But Melanie takes herself off to a barn and a wash house in Iowa. So being a complete ignoramus who's not from the United States, I was going around telling people that she was painting a wash house in Idaho, and people were here to point out that Idaho and Iowa are separate states, which is fine by me, but it spoils the pun that I was working on, which was to be that Idaho is Melanie Vote's own private yardo, but it doesn't work because unfortunately it wasn't in Idaho after all. It was in Iowa. Anyway, great. I think the thing that really comes across in Melanie's exhibition, which is and the poignancy and layering. That one has a strong sense, doesn't one, of how layered a seemingly insignificant bit of architectural remnant in some farm in a state in the middle of America can be, in the prairie. That layering seems to me theme both of Melanie's visual response to the Washhouse and to both and to the place itself and to the residents of the place itself. We're very lucky to have with us today Doug Chafa and Kelly Madigan, and their home is, they're actually speaking to us feet away or yards away, or maybe half a mile away, because I'm sure the scale is completely different in Iowa than it is in Jersey City. But they are in close proximity to all the motifs that Melanie depicts. Now, and layering, if you're a poet, or in the case of Doug Chafa, a scientist concerned with land maintenance and the preservation of prairie, that you're acutely aware of layerings. And so let's think about layering for a bit. Melanie talked about the way in which native peoples have been largely perhaps eradicated from the prairie or from the land that this that your property is on. So tell us how you sense both historical and biological, or environmental is a better word, historical and environmental layering. How conscious are you as a scientist and a poet living in this place, Doug and Kelly, of the sense of layering?
Sure. Thank you, David. I think that I would say for me that I'm persistently conscious of the layers. For me, I think a lot of it is the historical layers. There was an elderly couple who lived nearby, Don and Eileen Reed, and they befriended me when I came to be here. And Eileen had been born in a house a half mile up the road that's no longer here. And she recalls that when she was about 7 or 8 years old, she would come down to this house. And it was the first time she'd ever seen a sidewalk. The people who owned this house had poured a little sidewalk. It's actually right in front of the Washhouse. And so she remembers, she talks about just with her little feet being on that little sidewalk. And she passed away a couple of years ago. She was 89 years old. And I don't know that I ever walk across that sidewalk without thinking about Eileen as a 7-year-old and her little feet on it. So and I don't know if I'm just wired that way, in part because I'm very drawn to metaphor. I'm very drawn to those historical layerings. But I know that when I talk to Doug, what he sees are the layers of land use and the layers of, well, I'll let you talk about that.
So the biology and the ecology of this landscape where the Washhouse sits, oftentimes we focus on the negatives, the clearing and the building of structures and planting a yard and terraces are pushed up and the soil's moved and the native plants are destroyed. But then here we are 150 years later, and one of the farms adjacent is now in public ownership, and the prairie seeds are being hand harvested off the hills and spread on what was agricultural fields. And so there's a restoration of some of those. And so there's, the plow line and the soil erosion is visible, to the eye, but yet here are all these grasses and plants that they're thriving. The resiliency of the ecosystem is pretty apparent. I know Melanie and Julian helped cut and remove cedars off a prairie hillside, and it was just barren underneath. And you think there's nothing there. There's no life there, but a year of sunlight and all of these native plants are springing forth and flowering, and so some of those, that push and pull, the negative side of maybe some of that destruction, you see nature resurrecting itself, during the same time that a structure like the Washhouse is rotting and decomposing and the paint's flaking off. In the backdrop of that is all these human struggles of just, I'm sure the families that have lived here over the years, it was very near and dear to them, that getting out of the wind in that wash house while washing clothes and hearing the birds in the front yard. And as we're sitting here talking, a flock of 25 blue-winged teal just came and went from the pond. It's just, it's hard to ignore the layers of interactions between wild things in this landscape, and just the forces of nature, the heat of the sun and the wind, and it affects you just directly. You just can't ignore it.
Melanie, you've described finding photographs in thrift stores and antique stores, and bringing also costumes, clothing that has some personal resonances for you to bear in relationship to the environment of the wash house. It seems that that's quite a conscious strategy of creating personal fiction around this place, at the same time that your mode is of realism. Now, of course, one can have realist fiction, but it is interesting to me that you, despite perhaps an abundance of data that could be drawn upon for the actual place you're at, that there's a desire to sort of dramatize and to find extra actors, as it were, to bring into this drama or narrative. So how conscious, tell us whether it's a happenstance or whether it's a deliberate strategy to create a more complex narrative out of the place that you're depicting.
Oh, certainly. I guess I'm trying to create some kind of complex narrative or relational aspect between the subject matter of human and landscape interaction. The objects are stand-ins for human interactions, or metaphors for that human impact, or evidence upon the land, or what's remaining in terms of memory. The work is definitely synthetic in the sense that I put these things together. I juxtapose different images, or superimpose an image within the picture, but yet I try to work from life as much as I possibly can. For instance, the overalls in the landscape, I hung them from a edge of a overhang and started the painting with the landscape, and actually the jar and the dress as well were started in that same manner, so that I could kind of see what it all looked like together, but and then finish the objects within the realm of the studio. So it's kind of a general process where I kind of construct a still life and landscape, and then bring the object home with me, or I can continue to work on it in that way and try to capture the landscape in the moment. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's
enough.
an answer.
Thank you.
That's all I wanted, is an answer. There's no the answer. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so Kelly, if I could ask you more specifically, how does do you feel your work is, I imagine, must be informed to some extent by Doug's discoveries. Do you feel that you are? Do you feel that it's interesting that Melanie used the term evidence as and contrasts it with stainings, and I think that that's a very interesting distinction, actually, because in a way, one person's staining is another's evidence. I mean, obviously, if you're a detective and there's some blood on the ground, that's both a staining and evidence. But the distinction, nonetheless, seems to me a vivid one, and I totally get it from an artist's point of view. Do you feel that in your literary response to place, that is there an equivalence of, does that distinction between staining and evidence ring true with you in a particular way, or is there some other some other distinction that you would make between qualities of metaphor when it comes to place and history and geography?
I think that's a great question. My mind jumps back to what you were saying a little bit earlier, that my work is so deeply informed by the work of people around me. And when Melanie comes here and sets up her easel and is working in the yard, or initially, many years ago, she had found a site that she wanted to paint that was about a quarter mile away, and she set up her easel on the side of the road, and the farmers would come by in their tractors and stop and talk to her on the side of the road, and it was just this juxtaposition to me of these two worlds. So I don't know that I have thought much about the that difference you're talking about between evidence and stain. I think that I discover things here. I have a poem about watching the body of a badger, a dead badger that was along the fence line, and just watching that kind of erode, I guess, dissolve over time. So to me, it was like one of the things that I'm doing, one of the things that Melanie is doing is trying to either discover meaning or uncover meaning that is already there. And here it's so, I don't know what it is about this particular landscape, and it's a very unusual landscape that is only a fraction of Iowa looks like this. It's a very distinct kind of place. So it's fraught with it. There's so much here to be looking at every day, and definitely the work of people has been beneficial in many ways to the world and to the inhabitants here, but also oftentimes I do look at, oh wow, they carved out part of that hill, and we can't ever rebuild that. And so that it's both the stain of human interaction and the evidence of human interaction and impact upon the land.
I gather that this that your property is actually in an untypical part of the state, in that it's not particularly arable land. It's a more sort of rocky kind of place. Is that correct? Sort of, or hilly.
It's mostly correct. Yes, it's not rocky, but most of Iowa is so flat that it was easily transformed into cropland. Whereas in the Luss Hills, there are areas that are so steep that you can't use the equipment because it would fall over. And so there are ridge tops and hillsides that were protected from agriculture basically just by their design. And that's where you would see these prairie remnants that Doug was talking about, where when we were able to go in, I'm surrounded, the place that I am is surrounded by 1,100 acres of public land that has been partially on those steep slopes and couldn't be farmed. And then some of it is now being restored back into prairie. And so that's where Doug was talking about kind of hand collecting seeds from plants at the tops of those hills to come in and reseed land that previously was prairie. So yeah, it's very atypical of most of Iowa.
This is, it's funny, when we were planning this afternoon's panel, Michael Gormley, the executive director, very wisely said, David, why don't you send the questions to the panelists so they can think about them? And I said, Michael, do you want to moderate this panel? I do things differently. I let the conversation flow organically. And now I found every single question I've asked you guys, as I've asked it, there's a sense of almost sadism in my, I think that's the question somebody is entitled to have thought about before. So actually, Michael's suggestion is vindicated. But on the other hand, the responses are very rich. And so but this next question is one that I feel some real guilt in asking, because you should have been given a bit more time to think. But nonetheless, I'll ask it. Doug and Kelly, have you learned something about your own property from Melanie's project?
I think one of the things that I've taken from Melanie's work is looking closer. You know, that close observation. I'm just blown away by the shadows under the paint curls and the small intricate details of the vegetation that she captures. You know, and I've spent the majority of my life looking at plant structures up close to identify plants, but to see that through that painter's interpretation and the beauty and the mystery in those dark tangles of vegetation, and probably that idea of, you know, something that is kind of old and, you know, and it's broken down and in some ways not very, you know, valuable monetarily, but it has all these other values and different ways of looking at that. Washhouse is, it's interesting.
She brings an intensity of gaze here that it's, I mean, we look forward every year to her informal residency here. And you mentioned that it's, you know, your Idaho joke. I got it. But Melanie and I actually met at an artist and writers residency program in Wyoming. And I, as a writer, have always loved going places and observing things side by side with visual artists, because they see differently than I do. Like, I almost see in words, and Melanie does not. You know, she sees it in this very different way.
It's true.
So when she comes here and she begins to look at something and she'll point things out to me, and I'm just amazed at times. Like, I walked past that shed, you know, hundreds and hundreds of times, and to me it was not the most interesting thing on this landscape, but by a long shot. And suddenly one day she had set up and was sketching outside of that, and I'm like, oh, you're sketching that? Like, what? But it has turned into this amazing project with so much depth and so much there's just a kind of adoration involved that has made the shed or the wash house more than it was. That it has elevated it from a humble structure into sort of a reliquary of everything that has happened or might have happened or that we have heard happened or that we imagine. And so, yeah, Melanie's, I live in, we live in this very, very rural part of Iowa. And Melanie's impact here and the vision that she brings here is changing the way we all look at our surroundings. Last year, I was so happy about this, but she came and did the keynote presentation at a local prairie seminar that's attended by a lot of people from Iowa. And I was celebrating that they were getting the opportunity to hear about her work and also just to see these structures through Melanie's very unique gaze. So absolutely, Melanie changes how we see this place. And of course, now I can't ever tear down the shed, no matter how problematic it may become.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Melanie, it just a thought that occurs to me is that some of the seminal figures of some of the key originators of the of 20th century art have been people who've taken mundane places and no pun intended, sort of edified them. I think of Cézanne's House of the Hanged Man, for instance, or just think of Morandi's Bottles. That the art of the overlooked. Did you feel conscious that you were adopting something overlooked when you were painting the wash house and the environment, or was it that you just felt and developed the attachment that you did?
I wasn't consciously trying. Oh, yeah. I wasn't consciously thinking about something overlooked. It was just, to me, it had such a magnetic pull that I can't even really understand where the interest was coming from. It was more as if it just, stopped me in my tracks, literally, and made me sit there and look at it. Maybe because it was so simple and almost symmetrical, almost altar-like. It seemed something just incredibly monumental to me for some reason. And I had to stop and think about what that was. And I don't think it was necessarily just the facade of the wash house. It was the buzz of the cicadas and the birds and the, being able to sit in a shaded spot and observe the light on this wash house and notice the crumbling paint. And also when you're there, especially by yourself, it's like you're absorbed in this orchestra of nature, and the incredible glow of the evening light. It's just all of those elements coming together that made me want to contemplate that structure. And also the strange, the strangeness of the door kind of creaking open because of the wind swinging. And before there was some cleaning up of it, the dilapidated nature of the window, and now the window is gone and it's boarded up. So that's when I first started looking at it. Anyway, but it is quite a mundane thing, but I didn't think of it as a mundane thing. It just seemed like a very attractive object that I wanted to contemplate.
Also, the great conceptual artist of the 60s and 70s, Robert Smithson, coined this phrase of place, non-place. And he was actually fascinated by ubiquitous, dreary, almost structures or places or bits of land usage that had no real resonance to it, and felt that that was something that had to be explored or in some way investigated, dignified, whatever. You've chosen somewhere that has the patina of history and as well as ecology. And I wondered what it is, therefore, in the big distinction. This is a question for everybody, and it's the final question I'll ask. Something that's clearly important to Melanie is the Roman concept of genius loci, the spirit of the place. Now, is the spirit of the place something that is historically and ecologically accumulating, or do you think that there is some spirit to a place that, this is perhaps asking you a question of something almost metaphysical, but do you think that there is a genius of place, a genius loci, a spirit of place, that is more than just the net result of an accumulation of evidence and stainings, or is it is that it? Would that just be a kind of require a leap of faith, and that in fact the spirit of the place is just the accumulation? Let's start with Doug on that one, and Doug and Kelly.
I guess my initial reaction to that is it's real similar to what unfolded this morning. The barn swallows returned to the barn, another mundane structure on site that's well past its prime, and it doesn't really matter to the barn swallows or the past flowers on the hill. That's their reality. It happens. It's happening right now, and so I see the ecology and the natural world kind of going on with or without our accumulations, and often a lot of my efforts are to undo the negative effects of humans being here, but at the same time I'm pretty acutely aware of, there were 2 houses in this valley 3-4 generations ago, and human impacts are less than they used to be right now. And some of those stains and some of that evidence is as it decomposes, is being erased from the landscape.
I love your questions, and I apologize if I'm not answering them directly, because oftentimes your questions just make me think of something that I want to say, which is that
thing you can say about a question. Don't spoil it by answering it.
To me, there is something very remarkable about this place, and I felt it myself, and then I've heard it repeated by many people who've come to stay here. And I would describe it as what the Irish call a thin place, where the veil is thin between us and the other world that we can't see. And so there have been multiple instances of people, smart, academic, scientific people hearing voices that they can't account for here, or experiencing a tremendous healing that was a long time coming, something that they'd struggled for years, and came here and they were unburdened by it. So there is, I don't know, are these hills sacred? Are they made sacred because of human experiences? Where we find that meaning and we pass that meaning along to one another, or is it really a notably remarkable situation here? I don't know the answer, and I feel like walking with that question is a pretty good way to live. So I'm enjoying walking with that question.
I love the notion of the thin place. It's like a portal in a way, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's a resonance. Yes. Place that for one reason or another has this resonance that it can prove to be a portal. Melanie, do you have a sense of your Washhouse and farm? Do you have a ownership of it that's as not as legally binding as Doug and Kelly's, but you have a kind of, in the way that Cézanne owns Mont Saint-Victoire, I think you own this Washhouse. Genius loci, is it a priori? I'm using a lot of Latin here. Or is it, what is the Latin is for accumulated? Is it accumulated?
Is there a spirit of a place? So I certainly feel it when I'm there, but there's so much just the individual human mind that conjures all of these things, of course, but it feels very evident when I'm there that there is some kind of spirit of a place, but it's hard to put into words, and I guess that's why I paint. If I might just answer it that way.
Your paintings are your evidence.
Yeah.
We won't call them stainings. They are your evidence. Excellent. Wonderful. Is it technologically possible, Julian, to bring in audience questions? I believe that is the case, isn't it?
Melanie, do you think the vast differences between the city where you live and this spot in Iowa help you see the surroundings in a more appreciative, artistic way? Yes, quite possibly. So I live in New York and in Brooklyn, in fact, and but I'm originally from Iowa, and the Washhouse, or where Doug and Kelly live, is about 100 miles from where I grew up. So I think being here most of the year and then going there is almost like an opportunity to go home, in a sense, to visit friends and family. Of course, I do. I have friends, I have family in the state which I get to visit. But going to Kelly and Doug's, it's almost like a home away from home, in the sense where I can kind of just really sink into the landscape, and then in that way paint and really appreciate that time. And then also when I emerge from that moment, I can share those experiences with Kelly and Doug about the visual experiences that I have had, and they also share their world with me. So definitely being here and kind of being starved for landscape, I get there and I'm very excited to be immersed in green and the natural world. So thank you, Tara.
Okay, I'm looking at a question that it looks like maybe two parts, from KL teaching, what about surrealism? And then from Sarah Olson, can you talk more about what you know about the history of the Washhouse? So I'll talk about the history of the Washhouse for a moment, and then I'll let you talk about surrealism. So the Washhouse it's a small building that's right next to our house, and it had a cement floor and wooden walls, and it was in 2 rooms. There were 2 doors to it, and one door went into a room that was basically as wide as that door. And what I understood from there was one family that owned this place for a long, long time. The man's name was Bob Nutt. His legal name was Ed Nutt. So depending on who you talk to, it's either Ed or it's Bob. But he had a couple of daughters, Beverly and Bobby, and I know them, and they have shared some of that history. So they're the ones who told us that that's where the laundry was done, that the wash house was where they actually did the washing. But also it became kind of a storage area as things changed and life progressed here. And so when I became the owner of this property, I was astonished to open that wash house and discover there was an upright piano inside of it, which I'm like, who puts a piano in a shed? But it was a childhood piano that was no longer in use in the house and needed to be somewhere, and that was actually a good structure to put it in to preserve it for a period of time. And then the cement floor had heaved up and had some damage to it. So now, we, in conjunction, very respectfully with Melanie, are looking at we've had it wired for electricity, and we've had it insulated, and we're looking at putting in new flooring and maybe a different window. And, you know, it could be a great little cottage, or, you know, an artist studio, but trying to also maintain that exterior structure that has now, as we mentioned, been elevated by Melanie's view of it. That's what I know about the structure itself.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. So one other thing I remember about the Washhouse from the conversations with one of Eileen's relatives. I'm sorry,
Beverly, I think
Beverly.
it was.
Okay, she shared her her memories of that piano and being there, and her job was to wash the jars, and then and also when they were finished canning, having to take them down into the cave or the cellar, and hating that part of it. So I did get to hear some stories from someone that actually lived there. And from KL teaching, what about surrealism? Surrealism, I don't know, it happened. In my mind, it's kind of a dirty word in the art world, that if it's a stigma, and it's not something I really claim. I know I'm certainly more inspired by Hieronymus Bosch and all of his bizarre imaginings, and also Leonardo da Vinci, just looking at nature and superimposing two things to create something like dragons, or that are something more fantastic. So I guess I try to not delve into the idea of surrealism. And actually, David, you could talk more about the origins of surrealism that I can, but I guess I feel like surrealism is illustrating dreams, and it's not something that I can speak of, or I can say that I subscribe to myself. So, but it does come up.
Yes. If you ask a surrealist, he'll tell you, or she, definitely a he if you ask the founder of surrealism, Andre Breton, he'll tell you that Hieronymus Bosch was a surrealist.
Okay, so maybe
grandfather of surrealism, and that there were surrealists before and after the surrealists. So you might be a surrealist without knowing it. But the other thing I would say, though, is that the surrealists do not have the exclusive on uncanniness and juxtaposition, although they do like to exploit them. And so I think to KL teaching, I think it's actually a very valid question, but it's best to make it a little bigger and say that it's a metaphysical painting that Melanie seems to be involved with at a certain level. I mean, if you just take your dad's overalls and float them over a field, you're already in metaphysical territory, whether you intend that or not. It doesn't mean you're the next Kiriko or the next Dali, or the next Robert Gober, for that matter. But it is nonetheless not a prosaic occurrence. I don't think if Dan or if Doug or Kelly are missing an item of clothing, they're likely to say, "Oh, genius Loki has hung it in the Westfield." So that is already. It may not be a highly sexualized dream scenario with a revolutionary pretensions in that sense, being surrealist, but it is. It's beyond real. It's metaphysical, and I think that's something that if you look at the literal meanings of the words that either de Chirico came up with for his painting, or that Apollinaire used to describe de Chirico's paintings, that was later picked up by the surrealists, surreal, that actually your work is super real. It's beyond the real, but it uses the real. It uses the real to go beyond the real. And that's the difference between evidence and staining, isn't it, really? Staining is the abstraction, and evidence is the metaphysical extrapolation from various materials that might include that staining or abstraction. So that would be my 2 cents worth on surrealism and Melanie Vote.
Well, thank you. That's greatly appreciated.
there are 1 or 2 others, but I think we're on, well, we've got time for one more question. Kim Power has asked, how were you able to hold on to your original intention for the work over time? Is there any particular piece of literature that was influencing your thoughts behind this installation?
That's a great question, Kim. A lot of things kind of crept in from literature into my work. I think over the last couple of years, listening to Margaret Atwood's speculative fiction, the trilogy, looking at our contemporary society and thinking about how it could evolve, has certainly been something coming into the forefront or kind of hanging around in my subconscious. Thank you. And how are you able to hold onto your original intention over the work, for the work over time? This evolves. Sometimes, we think we're going to do one thing and then we're led to do another. But I really did try to conceive of, first of all, the Washhouse was the anchor, and then the other pieces sort of grew out from that. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think it's probably might be Michael's job to thank everybody. I'm just an intermediate. I'm a thin place, as it were, in this great scheme of things. But nonetheless, as the moderator, I might just jump in and say, thank you very much, panelists, for putting up with metaphysical questions you had no time to think about. And thank you above all, I think, well, Melanie, for creating this work, and Equity, and Michael and Gina, and the members of Equity, Artist Equity, for first of all, giving a space to Melanie, and then persevering when, yes, biology, you're to blame, Doug, you realize? Biology has messed things up here. Actually, I thought Melanie had a question for Doug. Yes, didn't she?
I did, and some of it has already been touched upon, but I think it's a great way to wrap up. So, Doug, with all of your work in land management and preservation of prairie and so on, and during this time of the pandemic and climate change in general, do you see any signs of hope from the ground where, an experience or a story that you can share with us that could leave us with a sign of hope?
Hopefulness in the ecological world sometimes is hard to come by, but there are positive stories all around us, even in the as the world's going through this pandemic with the human exploitation of wildlife and creating that bridge for that disease to jump from wild animals into humans. Right here in the Loess Hills in Western Iowa, I mentioned the way the prairie comes back after decades under the shade of cedar, human-induced cedar invasion. Those plants just need the sunshine and they come right back. And the diversity is there, and those insects that need it recolonize, and the birds that use those prairies recolonize. And Dr. Dinsmore did 10, 12 years worth of research following how wildlife recolonizes restored wetlands, formerly drained wetlands that were farmed for 100 years, and now you break the tile and put the water back, and they're being used by all forms of wetland dependent wildlife. And so that's what keeps me going. That's what, I see a lot of recreational landowners that weren't, that wasn't something that was happening 10, 20 years ago, but now there's a lot of land that people aren't looking to extract the last dime of profit out of. They're valuing it for its wildness and for the scenery and for the hunting or the fishing or what, they're getting a lot more just existential value out of wildness and wild places and interactions with nature.
Thank you.
Science is the last word. Excellent. That's the way it should be. Thank you. And we also say goodbye to our wonderful audience and
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Thank you very much.